They have no moral compulsions about this at all. It's a good thing to have morality, absolutely. I mean, I'm glad to live in a country that has a sense of honor and morality, but my God, that puts you at a disadvantage sometimes, doesn't it?
I want to stop the conversation there for a second, put a pause in the action. I want to take it to our Sun News desk for a news flash.
Thanks, Ryan. A Sun News flash for you right now. A landmark land claim ruling from the Supreme Court of Canada to tell you about happening right now. The country's High Court has ruled that about 400,000 hectares of land that belongs to a small BC First Nation community called the Chilkat-Cam Nation means that the group now has control to decide what is developed on it. The landmark ruling could lead to other Aboriginal groups gaining title over huge chunks of BC, giving them the legal power to stop pipeline construction like the Northern Gateway Pipeline. More coming up after the break with Ryan Doyle.
Are you confused by all the expanding hoses on the market? Don't be fooled by imitations. Hi, I'm Michael Berardi. I'm the inventor of the X-Hose, the original force-weight guidance pump. My big boss at Powerful Spread.
Court ruling, and there we have it. The First Nations group that made this complaint originally, it's a group of about 3,000 First Nations out in British Columbia. They made it against the BC government, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled in favor of the First Nations.
Yep, and that's final. This one is a defeat for the federal government and the BC government, which had both said that this control of these lands ought to lie, if you're not on actual reserve land, it ought to be under Crown control, provincial or federal. So this is a setback, absolutely, for Ottawa and for Victoria. It's not a shock, I think, Ryan, if I'm not blown away by the ruling, but okay, as we were just saying before we found out, so fine. Now we know that the highest court in the land has ruled that these bands do have the right to control some of what goes on in this territory. Fine, not shocked by that. Can we please come up with a way of doing this that is efficient and basically serves all of our interests? Look, ultimately, unfortunately, the reality of it is, if they just take a totally obstructionist view and say, never, no pipelines under our circumstances ever, there might not be much we can do about that. The question then becomes whether or not they have the local leadership to really, as you would say, said there's always going to be a trade-off. Some of the BC bands actually do quite well. Others really struggle.
Matt, we appreciate you taking the time, and of course, we will continue to follow this story on the Sun News Network throughout the course of the day. We'll also talk about what happens when public sector unions go on the attack. That's coming up after your Hard News headlines here on the Sun News Network.
Provides a safe
Honey, I'm Eastern, 7 Pacific, and good morning. I'm Larissa Harrison at the Sun News Desk, and it's time now for your Hard News headlines. Well, a landmark land claim ruling from the Supreme Court of Canada that just happened. The country's High Court has ruled that about 400,000 hectares of land that belongs to Chilkat, a small BC First Nation. That means the group has control to decide what is being built on it. The landmark ruling could lead to other Aboriginal groups gaining title over huge chunks of BC, giving them the legal power to stop pipeline construction. Meantime, the City of Vancouver is taking steps to mend relationships and reconcile land claim disputes with its First Nations residents. City Council members unanimously passed a motion yesterday to acknowledge that Vancouver sits on unceded land belonging to 3 First Nation bands. But Mayor Gregor Robertson says the move is symbolic and says any actual legalities will be dealt with by the province or the feds.
Those negotiations are taking place with respect to treaty and rights and title. They don't affect the city formally. This is a gesture, a formal gesture of the city to acknowledge that fact, and we certainly look forward to the province and the federal government resolving those issues.
And let's get back now to that top story. The Supreme Court of Canada ruling in favor of a BC First Nations land claim. Joining us now is Jessica Hume, live from Ottawa. Hi, Jessica.
Hey, Larissa, that's right. This is a huge ruling that we've had just moments ago from the Supreme Court. And what happened essentially is that they've told this one First Nation group in British Columbia that they have title over a very specific area in that province. Now, what that means is this band has almost absolute control over what happens on their territory. So, of course, the big question here is what does this mean for the Northern Gateway? This is a proposed pipeline that would take Alberta's crude out through the Pacific Ocean, and the First Nations group have been some of the most vociferous opponents of that pipeline. Now, the Supreme Court set out very clear guidelines, you could say, in terms of how resource development goes forward when dealing with this First Nation that now has title. Essentially, anyone, a government or company that wants to have an operation is going to have to get consent of that First Nation. Now, if they are unable to get that consent, what they have to do is meet a very strict legal test demonstrating that whatever the project is would provide benefit for people living in these specific areas. So this is a huge unanimous ruling, 8-0, at the Supreme Court that essentially puts land control into the hands of this one First Nations group, and I don't think it's insignificant or unrelated that this same group has been very opposed to many of the resource development projects that have been proposed by the Government of Canada.
Now, this also means it doesn't only affect BC. I understand it's going to affect other provinces as well, like Ontario. I mean, there are pockets of land in Ontario that haven't been laid claim to as of yet.
Exactly. So the deal is basically this, Larissa, that many of these First Nations bands in British Columbia, they never signed any treaties. Many in Ontario specifically did, and what this means is they made a land agreement with the government. They were given reservations, and in exchange, they kind of gave up, they ceded land to the government. Now, the British Columbia, in the case of this British Columbia First Nation, they hadn't, and what you're talking about is other communities outside of British Columbia, but still in Canada, that also don't have specific treaty agreements with the feds. In the absence of a treaty agreement, this allows a First Nations group to stand on a much stronger legal ground in terms of making their case for claim over a specific area. Now, completely different, of course, when a treaty agreement has been signed, but this has huge implications, yes, for all First Nations across the country that have not signed any treaty agreements.
Now, it's really timely because, of course, it will affect the pipeline, and we've heard, Matt Gurney and Ryan Doyle talking about what kind of implications it will have on that pipeline, and a lot of people saying, who knows if this pipeline will ever see the light of day, and especially now. But actually, this goes back to 2 decades ago.
Oh,
this began... That's when it started, right?
Oh, yes. This is almost as old as I am. This began in 1983, and it started when the provincial government of British Columbia wanted to give an operating license to a logging company. Now, this First Nation group said, no, we do not agree with this kind of activity. We don't want it here in our land. And, in fact, we'd like to make that claim, that title claim. So this was a very protracted court case, obviously, because it's now 2014. BC Superior Court, BC Court of Appeal, and what we saw today was basically the final stop. The buck really does stop here, and in terms of what this means, I think it is significant, as you mentioned, particularly in this context where resource projects are of huge significance right now across the country. So, here we have the Supreme Court really saying to this First Nations group, we recognize that this is your land and that you should have the first right of refusal in terms of what kind of activity happens on it.
All right, and we will continue that discussion later today. Jessica Hume, thank you very much from our Ottawa Bureau. And, of course, we'll have more hard news headlines in about 25 minutes when news breaks. We'll flash it for you. It's back to Straight Talk with Ryan Doyle after the break.